What's an incredible fact that most people don't know about? Story 1. In mid-2000s, Kagoshima, Japan, an alarming rise in power blackouts was traced back to crows who were building their nests on top of electric poles. The power company formed a crow patrol in order to seek and destroy the crows' nests. The crows responded by building thousands of dummy nests as decoys. The war is ongoing. Story 2. Switzerland, the country of neutrality, has unintentionally invaded its neighbor Liechtenstein 3 to 5 times 1968 to 2007. 3 out of 4 times Liechtenstein didn't know of it until Switzerland apologized. The first out of four was that one time Switzerland fired a missile and caused a forest fire. Reparations were paid. After one incident, the Liechtensteiners reportedly offered drinks to the Swiss soldiers. A Liechtenstein spokesman said, "It's not like they invaded with attack helicopters." Story 3. If your intestines are in the way during abdominal surgery, standard procedure is to scoop them out and dump them in a bowl for the duration. Then basically pour them back in when you're done. As long as you don't pull enough to create an actual knot, the guts will wiggle themselves back into exactly the same shape and configuration they had before being disturbed. The first time I saw an aortic aneurysm removal, they put the intestines on a damp cloth. As soon as they removed the baseball-sized aneurysm, the intestines got pink and started moving on the table. It was like they came back to life. I thought they were going to fall off the patient, but they didn't. They just moved around and then they put them back in. Story 4. The weirdest animal in the world is the jellyfish called the Portuguese manowar, also called a bluebottle in Australia. It gives birth via a process called budding, where a new animal just sort of pops off a random place on the jelly. But it doesn't give birth to any other jellyfish. It gives birth to many different types of animal-like creatures called zooids. They live on the bottom of the jelly, live independently from each other, but can't survive without the others. For instance, there's a zooid that can digest fish, but can't catch them. There's a tentacle zooid that can catch fish, but can't digest them. There are also several other zooids like that. Scientists have been scratching their heads about how to classify this creature, and are calling it a colony rather than an animal. And that leads to an interesting question. What is the organism? Is it the zooid, because it moves around independently, but can't really survive very long on its own? Or is it the whole jellyfish? In which case the zooids are a bit like organs, except for the fact that they might go for a walk. And if you say that the whole jellyfish is the organism, maybe bees aren't an organism either, but a beehive is. That's the problem with classification systems. As soon as you make one, along comes some weird example that makes you have to start again. Story 5. Most of the time, the closest planet to Earth is Mercury. Actually, most of the time, Mercury is the closest planet to all of the other planets too. Even Pluto. If you don't believe it, try a quick experiment. Take 4 cookies, or other small objects, and line them up on a table in front of you, perpendicular to your body. The closest cookie represents Earth. The next cookie is Venus, then Mercury. Then the farthest cookie is the Sun. Obviously, Venus is closest to Earth in this configuration. Now, move Venus and Mercury in their orbits 90 degrees to the right, or left, it doesn't matter, of the Sun. Measure the distance from Earth to Mercury and Venus. Mercury is now closest to Earth. Move Venus and Mercury another 90 degrees, and Mercury is obviously closer, even without measuring, but measure it if you want to. Move Venus and Mercury another 90 degrees, and you'll have the mirror image of the first 90 degrees configuration. Measure it if you want to. Mercury is still closest to Earth. You have to move Venus and Mercury closer to the Earth before you get to a point where they are the same distance from Earth. It works like this for all the planets. Venus and Mercury don't revolve together like this in real life. They revolve at different speeds, but over thousands or millions of years, it all averages. Story 6. The emotion you feel when realizing that the people around you are complex human beings like yourself with emotions, memories, and someone inside there is called sonder. Many will recognize this as a word made up by the people who run the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. On the one hand, I think it's great that there's a shorthand tool of a word that can encourage people to think about their place in the world. That said, Cinder annoys me so much, and it's difficult for me to explain. Maybe it's knowing that it was made up so recently in comparison to other words, and not in response to a gap in the language, but purely to affect emotionally. I also hate the fact that it's wonder with an S slapped onto the beginning. People seem to react really positively to learning this word. It's intrinsically awe-inspiring and aesthetically appropriate given its assigned definition. But all it does for me is remind me of the absolute most incurably dramatic of my peers in high school. It feels cheap on the tongue, real tinny words. And if I ever heard someone say in earnest, I was sitting in traffic and started looking at the cars around me and was struck with such a sense of sonder, I might die from cringe induced multiple organ failure. Story 7, Modern Postural Yoga, the type and style predominantly practiced in Western countries, is about 100 years old. It was invented in India by Indians and is derived mostly from British calisthenics and Swedish gymnastics. It was specifically marketed to affluent Westerners by Indians as a superior form of spiritual and physical exercise. It's working as designed for its target market. Story 8, Nike has warranties on their shoes. If yours remains in the tread life and within the warranty date, you just make a claim. And they'll give you a voucher for new shoes and paid postage to send the old ones back. Target will also take any Cat and Jack clothes back for an exchange as your kids grow. Brake pads only need to be bought once for the life of a car. They are then warranty exchanged as you wear them out. Clearly, I'm a dad. Story 9, the great leap in computing processing speeds and power mean that it's impossible to beat the original version of the seventh guest on modern PCs, at least without cheating. During the microscope puzzle, the game uses an AI to choose a move for the opponent in the puzzle, with the system getting a limited amount of time to decide its next move. But in systems faster than 66 megahertz of processing speed, this means that the system can calculate a much larger number of moves than intended by the developers, meaning that the AI is effectively unbeatable. The same issue appears in its sequels as well, which uses more AI puzzles, re-releases, and I think since it was rebuilt from the ground up, the recent VR version have majorly fixed up the system's programming to account for this bug. Story 10, a large number of stories slash legends slash myths that we still live by today originated over 10,000 years ago during the Ice Age. This is why, for instance, there are many stories and age-old tropes that can be found in cultures around the globe. This is why you find, for instance, Native American stories with shockingly close parallels in Europe, Asia, and Africa, because many of these stories originated before humanity dispersed throughout the world. In the same vein, many myths are actually believed to have a basis in folk memory from ancient times. Many legendary animals like the unicorn actually have a basis in early humans' interactions with long-extinct creatures many thousands of years. The craziest fact about this is that certain legends of human-like entities are theorized to date back to early Homo sapiens interactions with other now-extinct human species. For example, the reason trolls are so big in Northern European lore is believed to go back to early Homo sapiens' interactions with Neanderthals, which mainly occurred in Europe. After they went extinct and the stories about them kept being told, they emerged as part of a legend whose origin, in fact, listeners were unaware of. I read somewhere that there are folk legends from the Philippines and South Pacific about a legendary race of tiny humanoid beings, which figures heavily into their mythology. It turns out that in remote islands in this region, subspecies of humans who were about 4 feet, due to their isolation from other humans and limited diet, did in fact exist, which many believe to derive from early memories of this subspecies that were passed down through the ages, even long after they were outcompeted for resources by Homo sapiens and went extinct. Story 11, I've posted this before. The United States Deep Black works in conjunction with non-terrestrial organizations, utilizing quantum vacuum propulsion systems, which offer superluminal travel. We've had incredibly advanced technologies for decades that have essentially created a whole other system that operates independently from Earth. Space travel is extremely fast and safe when you utilize a quantum vacuum propulsion system, which encompasses the craft. The void it creates blocks all harmful radiation while acting as a shield, deflecting debris. It also eliminates issues with G-forces and inertia. This technology, along with the portable fusion reactor, was developed in the 1970s and perfected in the 1990s. With the advent of the Space Force, it will most likely be declassified over the next 30 years. Story 12. If you put people across multiple age groups in a room and turn off the lights, the older people glow in the dark slightly more than the young. And it has nothing to do with age. It's because generations who were alive from the 40s to 60s during the golden age of nuclear testing have been exposed to more radiation than younger ones. Even though this testing mostly took place out in the desert, they were exposed to small levels that demographics born afterwards, and certainly age groups born after the Cold War, were not. Story 13, I'd argue that most people worldwide don't know too much about ice hockey. Wayne Gretzky is the points leader in all of the NHL. If you were to take away every single one of his goals he scored, he'd still be the points leader in the NHL. Furthermore, if you were to divide his points into two and counted him as a tandem, He'd be the highest scoring tandem in the NHL. He owns or holds a share of over 60 NHL records, among others. He's quite literally, in my opinion, the most dominant athlete in his prospective sport in the history of sports. He's also a really nice dude. Story 14, you're not just related to your parents, or your great grandparents, or all other humans, or all other apes. You are literally related to everything that is alive. Life formed about 4 billion years ago via abiogenesis. This was a singular event, one living thing. From there, everything evolved via natural selection. Animals, plants, fungi, viruses, we are all related and can trace our ancestry back to that first common ancestor. Everything organic that you see around you is quite literally a distant cousin of yours. Story 15. White sharks can't be kept in captivity, as they always let themselves die. The University of California, an American one for sure, decided to do everything in their power to find a way to keep one in captivity. They trapped a young great white shark in the ocean so it got used to a form of captivity in its own natural habitat, slowly reducing the size, like a frog that you boil, and transported it in a tank. They usually sedate animals and keep them moist. And they did it. They managed to keep a great white shark in the Monterey Bay Aquarium for 6 months. It was freed after ending more than 40 other individuals. They didn't try again. I guess they were happy to be able to say they did it. Story 16, vegetable oil and seed oils in general are byproducts of petrol. Olive oil, ghee, and avocado oil are the healthier and natural options. The oldest living thing discovered on the planet was a clam that was 500 years old, and the scientist who discovered it killed it out of curiosity. The United States, at the time of its founding, was almost named Fredonia. The name was rejected because it made us sound too European, especially since we had just seceded from a European power. Also, prior to the Constitution being ratified, there were 8 individuals who served as president under the Articles of Confederation. Lastly, the U.S. Constitution was conceived unintentionally, but as a means to strengthen the existing legal document. Story 17. That even if there was nothing before the existence of our universe, that nothing is still technically something, which means that it had to originate from something, and that somewhere had to originate from something. And this loop concept goes on forever. There is no end or beginning. But even an infinite thing with no beginning or end had to have been created by something at some point. How can there be existence if there was no existence of anything before that existence to create an existence? I'm already spiraling into this loop speaking about it. Story 18, 99.2% of the U.S. population would not be able to be called to action for World War III. The United States of America has a population of 331 million people. Only 17 million, 5.1%, are between 18 to 25 and available for military service. Of the 17 million, 71%, 12 million, are too fat or have other comorbidities that make them ineligible for military service. This leaves only 5 million, 1.5%, of the population capable of actually serving in the military, with 2 million both becoming available and no longer being available for service each year. If the United States ever had to rapidly mobilize for war, like it did in 1945, it would be unable to because 98% would be too old, fat, or sickly to serve. If you factor in that only males would be called up for selective service, that goes up to 99% not available. Story 19, black holes don't just suck you in, they remove all the other possible futures in which you could possibly escape. As the energy required to push out of the black hole's gravity increases, the possibility of a future in which you escape decreases until any path forwards in time also leads you deeper into the singularity. Moving forward in time becomes synonymous with moving towards the center, and of course, no one can stop moving forward in time. Story 20, imagine this. You are out on a date with the person of your dreams. Suddenly, you get a splitting headache, one more severe than you've ever experienced. You tell your date you're sorry, but have to cancel the date early. As you stumble to get out of the restaurant, you drop to the ground with a thud. You are dead. Cause of death? Brain aneurysm. The problem with aneurysms is that they are a relatively silent medical problem. Most people don't know they have a brain aneurysm until they get a checkup for something else or it ruptures. So if you don't need to go to the doctor often or don't go to the doctor for anything head related, you may never even know that you have an aneurysm. The scariest part about brain aneurysms is that they are like the assassins and snipers of medical problems. You could have one and never know it until it is too late. Some brain aneurysms are treatable with emergency surgery, but if one ruptures badly enough, you could be dead sooner than you could make it to the hospital. Although 1 in 50 people may have a brain aneurysm in the USA, The rate of rupture is 810 in every 100,000 people. So it isn't like everyone is walking around with a ticking time bomb in their head. The bad news for me personally is that African Americans and Hispanics have twice as many incidences of an aneurysm rupture than whites do. So hopefully, that doesn't make me 4 times more susceptible. All I can do is cross my fingers and pray to God that my family, friends, and myself don't suddenly get a splitting headache. Story 21. Your time is much more finite than you think, given the infrequency of some common things in your life. My parents are 70 years old and live an 8-hour drive away. I see them about 2 times a year during holidays. It's unlikely they'll live past 90 years old, meaning I will see my parents 40 more times in my entire life. I am making the effort to visit them 3 or 4 times a year. I read 5 or 6 books a year on the bus ride to work and don't often read outside of this time. I'll probably read more once I retire, but odds are I will only read another 200 books in my entire lifetime. Maybe I should branch out and read more renowned or diverse or interesting books instead of rereading the old sci-fi bookshelf, or a lot more time in my day to read books for enjoyment. Story 22, that the modern poisoner is overrepresented statistically in caregiving fields. That's 60% of the time, it's a man, and always someone you'd never ever suspect. They tend to have avoidant conflict styles, so you'd never even know if they were mad at you. And worse, they feel really entitled to get whatever they want from you. And if they don't get it, they proceed to poison you. Happened to me. It happens, so treat people with care and respect because you never ever know who you're dealing with. Story 23, read this on a daily fact calendar, so I have no idea if it's true. But it said, blood can be used as a substitute for eggs when baking. Now, we don't have time to unpack all of that, but it does raise a few points. It's disturbing if that's true. What's more disturbing is the circumstances in which that was discovered. I mean, you're not baking a cake in the woods and think, I don't have eggs for this cake. I'll just use some of my blood. What's most disturbing to me is that once this was discovered, that person went and told someone else. I feel like if you had that knowledge, you'd keep it to yourself if you wanted to have friends. Think about this fact the next time you eat red velvet cake. Story 24. I don't think this is exactly simple. Took me a bit to wrap my mind around it. But there is a valid reason why looking at your reflection for too long or in dim lighting makes you uncomfortable. The Troxler effect, a phenomenon where if you stare at a point long enough, the surrounding details of the stimulus fade away as unimportant, coupled with our brain's natural impulse to find faces in things. If you stare into your reflection long enough, peripheral details of your face, forehead, chin, ears, jaw, etc., will become muddled to the point where even though you will recognize that the face in the mirror is in fact a face, your brain will tell you it's not yours. Story 25, solitary confinement was first instituted by the Quakers in the 1700s. The idea was that the confined would only have his own thoughts to keep him company, and thus the prisoner would come out of confinement, born again, and reformed. In actual fact, such prisoners were driven insane by the isolation and frequently ended themselves, or became so violently paranoid that they were never able to rejoin society. The tragic irony is that this started as a more humane alternative to the death penalty. Story 26, the Carter Doomsday Hypothesis explains the following. If we assume the population of humans will continue to grow at a predictable rate, and we assume that at some point human civilization will end, you are exponentially more likely to be born to a group of humans where the end of civilization will happen within or soon after your lifetime. For instance, while about 109 billion have lived, 7.9 are alive right now. If we colonize the galaxy, start building O'Neill cylinders, Dyson spheres, and other megastructures in the future, it becomes astronomically unlikely that you were born to live today versus being one of trillions of future humans. Meanwhile, if we say the world ends tomorrow, you have about a 7.2% chance of being born to that last group of humans. Doesn't sound like much, right? But your odds of being born in 1800 would be, by comparison, about 0.09%. Presumably, after an apocalyptic end to society, populations will again shrink, lowering the chances you will be born after. The dice are stacked so that you will be alive to see the end of human civilization. Naturally, it's no certainty, but it is the most probable scenario, especially with how large an interstellar civilization might become. Story 27. This will get buried, but a thing called hemi-neglect, which is generally due to a lesion of your right posterior parietal lobe. You basically forget about half of your entire field of view. Your brain can still see it, as there's activity in the visual processing center of the brain associated with that visual field, but there's no actual processing for the person to recognize. Imagine this. You enter a public bathroom with the exit on your right to your back. You do your business, turn around, and now cannot see any exit to the bathroom because it is now on your left. In some cases, people with hemineglect don't even register their own limbs or body parts as it's not uncommon to see a person with hemineglect shave only half of their face, but think they've shaved all of it. Rehabilitation for this injury is literally just working with and reminding the patient that half of their world still exists. Story 28. Only about 25% of what you see is actually there. By see, I mean the image is collected from the retina in your eyes. The other 75% is constructed by the visual cortex in your brain based on a best guess on what it thinks should be there. Humans simply don't have the resolution evenly across their retina to adequately explain the feeling of presence we all feel. The world you see is mostly a construct. Away from what you are focusing on, the resolution of the retina is extremely poor, and vision relies on the ability to rapidly move the point of focus onto something else, stitching all the high-res snippets together, and just filling in the rest. The density of light-sensing cells in the fovea, the bit you focus on, is about 40 to 60 times higher than that of the rest of the retina.